Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff Neal. I am the Director of College Counseling at Graded, the American School in Sao Paulo, in addition to being an instructor at UCLA Extension in the College Counseling Certificate Program. And I am super excited and blessed to be joined by Rick Clark from Georgia Tech. Rick, would you take a minute to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, happy to. Yes, Rick Clark from Georgia Tech. I've been now with the Institute for 20 years. And up until just January, I was the head of admissions. I'm transitioned, I'm still in enrollment management at Georgia Tech, working now with a little more of our student success and fundraising for scholarships and some of our access and affordability initiatives. So still very much connected to admissions, and excited though about this kind of new chapter and the work I'm getting to do.
Well, wonderful. Well, welcome. And again, like I said, I'm super excited to dive into this topic with you. And so just as a little bit of context, this is part two of a two-part series through the UCLA Open X Open program where we're looking at the ways in which artificial intelligence is transforming the way we communicate, learn, work, and the ways in which it's had a significant impact on the college application and admissions process. So that said, the first part was, I think, 3 weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, in which it was more of a how-to. And in this session, Rick and I are meant to explore a little bit more about the ethics and implications of artificial intelligence in the college admissions process. As I look through the guest list, I'm super excited to see lots of familiar names, particularly students in my current course. So that's great. Thanks for joining us. But that said, Rick, can you give us a little bit of background I suppose, particularly the last, I guess, 14, 15 months in regards to generative AI and the way you as a working professional have engaged with it?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny because I think in a lot of ways, the concept of generative AI really came on my radar through my kids, who now are a ninth grader and a seventh grader. And I kind of heard them talking more about it, seeing the way that they were actually starting to use it. And, it just got me thinking this would have been maybe I'd say December of last year, where, I kind of heard them talking about it, started to feel like everywhere I turned, I was reading and listening to podcasts that were mentioning us. And then of course at Georgia Tech, we have some pretty world-renowned experts that are working in this field. And it went from like almost no awareness to everywhere I turned, was surrounded by the concept of ChatGPT or Bard or any of these other, big language tools. And at that point for us, our deadline was about to expire, right? So, we weren't really going to get more applications, but I did start thinking we got to get on the stick here. I mean, we need to figure out what are we going to do for the next cycle. And I guess, for me, I was just thinking, well, Common App, they'll have a solution. I emailed, Jenny at the Common App and I said, what are you guys thinking about? What do you think you're going to do? And will you have like a reverse AI type of tool that'll maybe show a student like the percent it seems that they've used it and let them at least consider whether or not they want to submit, essays or anything else with it. Absolutely no. I mean, I got a response, but it was like, no, we're not doing anything. And then
Sure.
similarly, I reached out to a professor at Georgia Tech. His name is David Joyner. Absolutely worth following on Twitter. Absolutely brilliant guy, just voracious reader, extremely involved with our online masters in computer science, which is, the world's largest real disruptor in that space. And I asked him like, what can we do, on the reverse AI side? And his words that just really stuck with me and changed the way I was thinking were that's a fool's errand, that you cannot trust. You cannot trust the results of that, and you're going to need to find a different way. And we can talk more about it, but it set us down this path of thinking about, well, what's our campus going to do? Like, will there be a uniform policy for our students? We talked to our provost, we talked to faculty members. And as we went further down the road, it's like, no, we're going to need to figure this out for ourselves because we're not getting a uniform policy. There's not going to be a lot of direction. And ultimately we came to this idea that we need to just embrace it and give students guidance and create a policy, not so much rules per se, and definitely not prohibition, but more so just like, all right, we know this is part of your lives. We do think that there's some real value here. Let us try to at least give some guidance and guardrails, things to consider, knowing that this is just a ubiquitous part of their daily lives.
Sure, yeah, and at this point, I know a little bit of the background. Was it maybe a year ago now? Maybe 10 months ago, 11 months, where Georgia Tech came out with a statement on its use of AI in the college application process. Is that about the right timeline?
A little less than that. We went through the spring and we talked to our provost and
Right.
went back and forth. And I in June went out to Idaho for a public schools admission kind of leaders conference and brought it up. And I mean, literally the only person there who was thinking about it in a similar way was Juan from Virginia Tech. And we had a good conversation with it, about it. And I said, well, do you have a policy? Have you kind of created guidance? I showed him our working draft. And then it was after that. So it really wasn't until probably into July, which was fine because for a while we were thinking we needed to have it in our Common App, when a student opened that up. Ultimately what we did was we just went with a sentence that said, we encourage you to review our guidance around AI, and it kicked them over to our site, which also allowed us to kind of like tweak that before the Common App opened, and that really worked out well.
Oh, interesting. And just as a quick aside, at this point, I mean, Georgia Tech has a statement, and I in a moment I want to hear more about sort of the evolution of that and where how that all kind of came to be. But how many schools do you know of right now that have an AI statement in their application
Yeah,
process?
very few. I mean, obviously, you work with students, and probably the people on this call, are probably more aware of the landscape than I am with this. But in talking to friends that are counselors, and even some other admission colleagues, I've had way more calls from people saying, "How did you come to this?" And what were your conversations with faculty, et cetera. Then I have people sharing their policies
They're
or their guidelines. Yeah. And so we I mean, I'd say maybe like seven or eight that I'm aware of, which is
yeah,
again just shocking. I don't know if it'll be this coming cycle, that more will sort of adopt. But I was just so surprised. And I mean, even in our information sessions, like every day we talk about this. When students are visiting, it's part of our information session. We just say, have you used AI? How's it been going? How have you used it? What have you found? And then we tell them what we think, where we see value, not just maybe in supplements or essays, but also potentially even in the way they're constructing their activities list, or looking to build a college list.
sure, sure. Yeah, when again, my memory being a little bit fuzzy, thought it was a little bit longer before that. But when Georgia Tech released theirs, I remember
Mhm.
reading it and thinking to myself, oh, well, this will open up the floodgates and everyone's going to come out. And my initial
Yeah.
thought, and I think you and I have spoken about this before, my initial fear was a place like Georgia Tech, which, opened up the door and really sort of encouraged students to think about it responsibly rather than deny access to it, um, seemed to fall on one end of this perceived spectrum. And I was really
Mhm.
worried about the other end, where a student might be applying to two different institutions. And I don't know, for whatever reason, I'm a product of a small liberal arts college, and I
Mhm.
had this fear that some of the small liberal arts colleges would come out and say, do not use it. You may not use it. And a
Yep.
student would be torn between these two poles of, well, Georgia Tech is encouraging me to use it responsibly, which I'm doing, but Bowdoin College, which is where I went, is saying, which they're not, but this is
Sure.
what I was envisioning, is saying you may not use it. And where does that put the student? And I was so worried about students being caught in the crosshairs. Did you guys think about that at all?
To be honest with you, we really didn't. We just, I guess it's like anything that you may be an early adopter of. It's like our thinking was maybe more just centered on what we really thought was right and what we really thought was helpful and what we thought would alleviate some of their concern or stress or anxiety. I mean, you bring up a good point, and frankly, like that went through my head too, not so much about how the student would be caught in the middle, but more so like there could be that other extreme group. And our take on that was fine. Like if that's where they come down, like that's what everybody has to do is
Right.
figure out, you know, what type of student are they trying to draw and what kind of expectation are they trying to set for them when they arrive on their campus. And I guess I sort of blew through that earlier, but like that's why we went to the provost initially, was we said, if there's going to be something that, like, if our goal is to try to bring people into our community ready for it, then if the expectation of our community is going to be X, let's go ahead and say that. In other words, if Georgia Tech's going to have this expectation, in all of our classes that here's how you use AI, we'll just mirror that and link to it and say, here's how you should use it on your application. And I mean, it's funny because, like I said, between being at Georgia Tech and Wake Forest and Georgia State, I mean, I've been in higher ed for 25 years, and I've never really had a provost laugh at me that way before. uh, he's like, yeah, that's not how it works. Like, there's no way we're going to rein in all of our faculty. Like, in fact, we want them to figure out for their class
Yeah.
what's best. And I guess that kind of empowered us a little bit though to say, all right, we're on our own here to do what we think is best, and that's what we're going to run with. But I hear what you're saying about the two poles.
Yeah. Well, so that being said, to kind of give some context to the audience, can you tell us a little bit about the Georgia Tech statement and kind of your stance on it and kind of how it came to be?
Yeah. Yeah. So again, like left with Dr. Joyner telling us it's a fool's errand to run reverse AI.
Mhm.
And with our provost saying we're not going to adopt something. We just kind of sat down, and what we did was a number of our staff members actually tested it with some like mock essays that we were writing for ourselves, right? And so that was it. That was really informative because then we were able to like have a good conversation around what were we experiencing and what we came to realize. And I can think about a couple of my, mock essays that I was just making up, about basketball games and, community service opportunities and family trips and just random things. Um, was look, the idea of just like putting a quick response in and just like copying and pasting what you get out of there. Like, not only is that just like not what we want you to do, but it's not a good essay. I
No.
mean, like it's going to be generic. It's going to be all the things we tell students not to write. Like, you need to be specific. You need to be detailed. You need to, make it personal. And I have to say this, what I one thing that frustrates me about admission folks is they're constantly saying like, we want to hear your voice, we want to hear your voice, and yet we don't really go much past that to tell them how do you get to your voice, and and that's tough, right? I mean, and obviously in the school you guys have more access to and time to do that, but in an admission, I've heard so many panels and so many admission information sessions where they say that, and it's just like then they move on. It's like, finally, we have something to show you what your voice is not. And
Yeah.
that is a one-time prompt generated out of Chat GPT. And actually, I think that's helpful for students. I mean, really, I do, because they can say, okay, yeah, right. That is about my relationship with my grandmother and why it's, shaped who I am. That's none of that stuff's either accurate or that's not how I would say it or whatever. But like, one of the, as you all know probably better than I do, although I write a lot, so I do get this. One of the things that's so difficult is just getting started, and like if you
Yeah.
can have something, I feel like, if you can get the ball rolling on something, if you can have, something to respond to, it's like you start to form it and shape it. And I think that's what the writing process really is all about, is iterating, editing, refining, I mean, I think about my own writing and how that's what I spend a lot of time doing. But man, to just not be looking at that like blinking cursor is super helpful. And so that's what we've kind of settled on. And I could probably dig up the link and put it in the chat, but or people can just Google for it. But yeah, we basically said, listen, copy and pasting, not a good idea. But getting your ideas down, iterating, throwing out a couple different possible topics. Like, as you guys know, working with students, I mean, and we'll have this too. They'll say, like, I got like 3 things I'm thinking about writing about. Well, if you could just like get, ChatGPT or whatever it is to write those for you, essentially, there might be something like, yeah, I could run with that one. Or, and this is where I would like to take that. And, that I think is a gift, because like the application, I really hope there's no admission person out there that wants the application to be some gauntlet that kids, dread doing. So if we can help them move forward and arrive at the things we value, which is, like I said, their voice, specificity, individualism, details, like this is part of the solution, in my opinion, not a problem.
No, it's so interesting that you say that. You shared that about voice, about the ChatGPT being a tool that can help show what your voice is not.
Yeah.
For a long time, a longtime mentor of mine would say that I can't tell you how to get into a college, but I certainly can tell you how not to. And that's by being disingenuous, which is the exact same sort of context that you're sharing.
Yeah.
But sort of building on that, I guess one of my points of curiosity is kind of hearing what you're saying is that in some ways it seems that the advent of artificial intelligence, of generative AI, has enabled you to kind of double down on some of the principles, the values that you hold dear. But has this changed in any way, the sort of necessitated changes in any of the criteria that you use to evaluate applications?
It really hasn't. What I would say is, actually, I'm glad you asked the question that way, because what we really came to, even as we were working on this policy, is like, we don't, and also from Dr. Joyner saying that you're never going to know the extent to which a kid used AI, and you're going to waste a ton of time trying to speculate on that. Like, that is also a waste of our time. What we said is, why do we even have an essay prompt at all? Why is this of value to us? And let's look at our rubric for what we're trying to, solve for, essentially, and make sure that our rubric is sound. Because if a kid delivers, what we're looking for, then how they get to that is going to vary widely.
Sure.
It's going to probably have, various sources and assistants. Some of those could be human and some of those could be automated. But really, let's focus on our rubric. So I guess to answer your question, yeah, it did make us think a little bit more about the back end, not so much what the student was doing, but what we care about. And, I guess one other thing I'll just say about why I'm sort of bullish on AI is, one thing it is good at is grammar, and one thing it is good at is sort of like generally solid, language use. And that isn't what we're looking for anyway. I can say that for Georgia Tech. I mean, maybe there's some schools out there who are really, trying to be grammar hounds, but I think generally schools are saying the essay exists for you to tell us something we wouldn't have gotten elsewhere. And I talk to students a lot about this idea of the application. It looks like a form, but it's really a story that we read. And every section is a chapter. And so, like, what makes a good essay? Well, let's talk about what makes a bad essay. Like, a bad essay is when you tell us what you've already told us in another chapter, just in like prose. If you just like put your resume in sentences and you've already told us that in your activity section, you just wasted an essay. You can absolutely write the best and worst essay of the year about the same topic. But the really bad essays are the ones that just are wasted because, we already had that information. This is just a building of the story, another chapter in the story.
I really love that. Uh, looks like a form, but really a story. I really like
Yeah.
that perspective. No, and you also bring up that point about the demise of the essay. And there was
Mhm.
some writing, I think about this time last year. And then
Yeah.
there was this sort of hot second for a little while where I think that was in June when the Supreme Court of the United States came out with their um, sort of decision that sort of banned use of race in admissions and
Mhm.
affirmative action and that sort of thing. And there was a hot second there where people were talking about that is the maybe the thing that saved the essay
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
people were talking about how ChatGPT was going to ruin the essay and it
Yeah.
was going to render it obsolete because everyone was going to be using it. They were all going to become nebulous and disingenuous or all the same in some way, shape, or form. But all of a sudden, the only way for a student to talk about their own sort of
Mhm.
ethnic, racial heritage would be in the essay. Did you
Mhm.
guys have any sort of dialogue about that at Georgia Tech?
Yeah. Well, I guess what I will say is I'm still hopeful in some ways. I wouldn't say for the death of the essay, but for an expansion of voice, and I don't know how much we want to get into this. But I really believe that if what we value is, like I said, another chapter, if what we value is voice and detail and like, another like the dreaded P word that admission people use a lot, which is passion, right? Um, and really like these kids, I mean, again, I have a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old. I mean, these students live in technology and it's so comfortable for them. And I still am just kind of blown away that the 1974 format of the Common App and the sort of like medium of expression being the essay is still all we have. It just seems like the rest of our world has proliferated and this has somehow stayed static. And I really would like to see, and have been pretty vocal, which is probably why I'm not on the Common App board, about, like audio submissions. Maybe Georgia Tech doesn't care, right? Maybe to your point, Bowdoin wants it still written. But like, I would like to see a day come where a kid has the opportunity to just upload a voice submission or an audio, a video or audio submission. I'd like to see recommendations have the option. You want to write and you want to use ChatGPT or write your own, whatever, bullet points, I don't care. Or do you want to upload an audio or a video of you talking about the kid for, 30 seconds to 60 seconds? Like, I just think that, multiple mediums is the future. And I mean, I really would like to get there sooner than later. I wish we were already there. And so to your point, I actually wondered if the Supreme Court case may um, provide for that and accelerate the multiple mediums. And I actually think it probably will be the initiator of that. Whether or not it gets credit for it or not, we'll see.
Oh, that's really interesting. The multiple mediums as a sort of next step forward.
Yep.
I can certainly see, as you and I have spoken about before, so much of the appeal of artificial intelligence to me has been my sort of being a self-described efficiency junkie in the ways in which it
Yeah.
saves time. And a
Yeah.
30-second to 60-second video seems like a very different proposition than a traditional letter of recommendation that might take someone 3 to 4 hours. So
On both sides, actually, on
yeah,
both sides. Because the
yeah,
truth is, absolutely. So on your side, right? I mean, I'm extremely excited about, counselors' ability to use ChatGPT. I know in the last session you went into more of a how-to on that. But like
mhm.
again, with a freshman in high school and a seventh grader, like I want more adults in the building available to kids. I think that's a good thing. If you can cut your time, as I know you said you did, and maybe a quarter on getting your rec letters done, everybody's better off because of that. If there's ever a time from a mental health standpoint and from just like an
Sure.
availability standpoint, I mean, right. On the other side, for us, we, like for instance, Initial View is a company you're probably, obviously familiar with, being in Brazil, and some on the call might be too. So for years, we've had international students who have sent us, interviews. And they're, 12-minute interviews. Maybe you just watch like 3 minutes of it, maybe you watch more. But the truth is, you oftentimes we're doing something else while we're listening to that. So talk about efficiency, right? You're listening to the interview, but you're also like going back and checking something about the academics, or you're looking at the school
Sure.
cohort or whatever. And if we had more recommendations or student submitted essays, I argue that this is not additive on the admission side. It's not more like, that was one of the things I heard pushback on a little bit was, oh yeah, but who has time to add another 30 seconds or a minute to every read? I don't think it is. I actually think you're maybe you're not shortening it, but you're not adding to it. It's not additive in my opinion. As someone who is pretty experienced with what it looks and feels like to get those already in a different demographic.
Sure, and certainly not to, uh, uh, be an advertisement for Initial View. I've certainly talked to admissions folks at different schools where during committee, while they're debating, while they're discussing and asking questions and inquiring, maybe even voting if that's the way that they go about their particular practice, in the background is the Initial View video of the student
Mhm.
talking. So it's this
Mhm.
is kind of,
Yeah.
yeah, multitasking, but it's different from that. It's an efficiency factor, I think. Um, so um, that said, just out of curiosity, have you heard much in the way of feedback from any of your applicants this cycle now that you've added this statement? Um, uh, Pros, cons, heard much yet?
It's funny, especially in some of those information sessions, right? Like, that's where you'll definitely get people like afterwards, not so much during the session, but afterwards, students or parents will come up and be like, really? Like you're okay with that? Or they'll say, yeah, I'm not sure I'm really comfortable using it. And it's like, fine. Like we're not telling
No.
you need to. We're saying if you do, here's how you should, or consider using it and seeing if you find it helpful or not. And so that's I would say those are the most common sort of conversations and feedback we've been getting.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, and certainly some of that must play into the fact that you're an institute of technology, and this is
Right.
a fundamentally, though a large language model, it's still a function of pretty sophisticated technology. So,
Yeah.
did incidentally, Rick, did you see the recent news that University of Pennsylvania announced the first sort of AI in the Ivy League? Did you see this AI
Oh,
major?
oh yes, the major. Yes, I did see that. Yeah,
Yeah,
super interesting. Absolutely.
interesting. Um, I had presumed that there would have been many more. To see
Mm,
that claim, I presumed that there was many more already out
mm,
there.
hmm.
So it's an interesting kind of cutting edge, bleeding edge sort of thing.
Yeah.
I wanted to come back a little bit to that sort of detecting AI. So are you, out of curiosity, are you using any AI detectors in your sort of evaluation platform?
We're not. I mean, and I have touched base, since those early conversations last February, March, ish with Dr. Joyner, because his thing was, look, this is moving so fast, like nothing is good enough to handle the rapidity and the evolution that we're dealing with right now. And so I touched base with him. I think the last time we had this conversation was October or November, and just asked him again, like, what do you think? And he, same answer, and I really consider him to be like a world class
Yeah.
expert. I mean, and so I think that's been liberating for our staff though, is like just the way we don't sit there and speculate about, do you think that, some 45-year-old helped them write this? We're not like sitting there going, what's the average age of the person who touched this application? We're not doing that with what's the, percent to which they might have employed, AI in this. Like at the end of the day, it's about our rubric. I think that's really at the end of the day, that's what it's about is we need to build our review rubrics to solve for what we care about in the essay. And then, and so look, if it's super generic, if it's not detailed, if it doesn't lend any, again, additional information or voice or specificity, like that's just a really marginal, unhelpful essay, and it's going to be reviewed as such.
Mhm.
And so I think I really do feel confident about where we are right now with our approach. And I'm actually like, as I said, I was surprised. I thought we were like behind the curve, and it's been interesting to find that that hasn't been the case. And it's also, sometimes when you find that you're the only one out there doing something, it's nice to be affirmed that you actually got it right, because you don't always get it right when you're early. Um,
For sure.
on that note, another thing that I've been surprised that more people haven't done is a couple of years ago, we went to, this is a tangent, but we went to no deadlines on holidays or weekends, and our thought was like for kids, I mean, it's stressful when you can't get in touch with somebody at the college, the counselor's not available or working or teachers or whatever. Like let's make sure our deadlines always fall on a weekday. And like we got rid of January 1. Like we had, so we never do those either. And I just have been like disappointed and surprised that more schools haven't followed that. But I also am pleased that like I know we're right. I know we're right. It's
Mhm.
on them that they haven't kind of followed that path.
No, and it certainly follows that theme of sort of being sort of principled and thoughtful in your intentions and implementation. Oh no, and I am going to be very curious to see how things go when your own child, you shall be
Mhm.
escorting to different interviews and info sessions and things like that to see how that plays out. Um, I've heard the same
Yeah.
thing for myself, so
Yeah.
it's it's fair. Um, yeah, no, it is one of those amazing things where when somebody gets it right, it doesn't seem always to catch like wildfire the way that it does in maybe other industries and other sort of
Yes. Yeah.
sectors.
Agreed.
Education, it's more a testament to the fact that education is so slow to change in
It's
so
so
many ways.
slow. Yeah,
Um,
we could go into a whole nother thing on that.
that's a doctoral dissertation waiting to happen. I'm sure it's happened a million times actually.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the things that the sort of the follow-up about the detecting AI usage, and I was curious if you guys had spent any time looking at this. There was some research that was done in the last year, obviously, about how the false positives, so those situations where artificial intelligence detected, I'm sorry, the artificial intelligence detectors falsely
Mhm.
identified text as being created by AI was disproportionately large with non-native English speakers. Did you happen to encounter that research?
No, no, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, and it was kind of suggestive that because of the, most native speakers of any language pick it up in a much different context than
Mhm.
non-natives who learn it in a classroom, who learn more rules and articulation
Ah,
than the
got
natives.
it.
So then when they write a sentence and they're using precise grammar and punctuation and syntax and often word choice, uh, it triggers at a much higher level. So
Mm.
that's been a big concern for a lot of us working overseas is our
Yeah, it's
non-native
interesting.
English speakers. And I was told, though of course I don't have access to it, that Slate, with one of those. You
Mhm.
guys, do you guys use Slate?
Yeah.
Yes, or
Yes, we
and
do.
I was told that you can trigger on a AI detector at some point in some way, and we were quite concerned about that. But it hasn't come to be a problem, but one of those
Right.
ethical conundrums.
Yeah, I mean, Slate is planning to roll out a little bit more for the colleges to use on our side from a kind of machine learning standpoint. But that has not, none of that has been rolled out, to this point.
Oh, that's good to know. Good to know. I know that was one of those when the article came out. I think it was in like the LA Times or something like that. Many emails from a concerned parent about that.
Uh-huh. I actually
Uh,
did have something funny happen the other day. A counselor called me and she's like, we have an admitted Georgia Tech student who has been called in for discipline around AI. She's just sharing this story. And she said, the teacher was accusing the student of using AI in the classroom. And in the end, this sort of backs up what you're saying, I think, about the non-native English speaker, different example. But essentially, the kid has a photographic memory. And, it was basically like just literally like, on whatever it was, a test or a quiz or who knows what, like just spot on verbatim with whatever he had seen. And so in this, she was basically emailing me to say, this is the kind of kid you're getting.
Yeah.
And she said, I sat in this discipline committee and he basically proved that he has a photographic memory. And he's just like on page 38, paragraph 2.
Yeah, just
I'm just like, oh,
just
like Goodwill Hunting,
yeah. No,
yeah.
that idea of the eidetic memory, that I've seen a couple of different instances of this in magazines and things like that, where it was like the kid with the perfect memory versus artificial intelligence, who
Mm,
wins,
mm,
and
mm. Yeah,
fascinating
for
to
sure.
think about,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
Um, so interesting. So, it comes up in the chat from Ramey,
Okay.
but it's actually also my next sort of direction is Georgia Tech sort of moving in the direction of incorporating any artificial intelligence into your own sort of internal processes?
Yeah. So, I mean, to be honest with you, we are kind of waiting on Slate a little bit here because of some of the things that they have said are coming, and I believe that will be for this new cycle. I'll tell you a couple that if they don't, we have some backup possibilities for with, like I said, some on-campus experts. But for instance, summarizing, rec letters, maybe grabbing some like key highlights or bulleting out some things to spotlight, right? So if you're kind of skimming, like here are some things that you can, pay attention to. With some of this, what I would call scraping. And so like, for instance, as many on the call may know, there's like been a real proliferation of self-reported academic records. Um,
Oh yeah.
and I think those start with good intentions from colleges, they're like, okay, uh, rather than the kid have to maybe get a transcript sent or get another one done, like we can just give them the ability to report their grades. But as those have proliferated, it's actually become burdensome, I think, to counselors and students. And to give you a very specific example, Georgia Tech doesn't have a self-reported academic record. We ask for transcripts, but what humans currently do, and reasonably well-paid humans do, is they go in to the application, and for us we value math progression. And so a human will go in, they'll look at your math courses, they'll find your quote unquote highest level math, which we kind of have determined what the hierarchy of that is. They will find that, they'll go to a drop down menu, they'll select BC calculus or linear algebra, and then they'll go and figure out, was that the highest level math ever, or what are you taking in a senior year? So for instance, let's say a kid takes BC Calc as a junior and AP Stats as a senior. We would say the highest level math is the BC Calc and the senior math is AP Stats. So a lot of times, senior and highest are the same, right? They could both be differential equations or something. But
Yeah.
that's a waste of time. I mean, it's important and it has value in our review process. It is a freaking waste of time for the human. And they will be better at, and maybe more available, just like I said about counselors in the school, meeting with families, staying on the road longer to recruit, delving deeper into applications, and instead of taking their time to do that. So that's where I think the kind of machine learning AI piece is coming. And I hope that that then kills all the proliferated self-reported academic records. We can get back to, right, just upload the transcript, because then you have the program that is pulling and recalculating, and you can then program it to do however you want. If you want to do the +5 for IB classes, great. If you want to do only core, you program it to read as you want it to, and then it sort of spits it out from there. It could get quicker for decision release also. That's a good thing. If we can get more decisions on the street faster for kids to have more time to get packaged or to visit or all the things, that's positive. So those things are coming. And I, that's where I'm pretty optimistic as well. Those come immediately to mind.
I I don't think I'm forbidden from sharing this, but I had a conversation recently with somebody who had a kind of behind the scenes conversation with um, somebody at one of those self-reported academic record companies, and
Yeah.
they are heavily investing in artificial intelligence with the
Mhm.
vision, as I understand it, that a student would upload an unofficial version of their transcript. The AI would scan it, make sense of it, and then the student's obligation, instead of typing in everything manually and figuring out like semesters, quarters, whatever, it would already be there and they would just be verifying it. It would be more of
Mhm.
a process of verification. And their suggestion, if I understood correctly, was that it would cut time consumption by students about 90%, which
Yeah. Yeah.
that's the big
And it's funny, like I think you and I were actually even talking about this, but there was some like really just ridiculous non-factual, like random seeming surveys that came out talking about schools are already using 85% of schools are using AI or whatever. Like it just depends on like what you call AI, right?
yeah.
But
True.
like I think what it set off in people's minds is, oh man, at Yale, they're just like typing in some code and going to lunch,
Yeah.
like,
Let the computer
and
think while I
that,
go do something else. Yeah.
right, right, right. And I mean, anybody that's used voice to text would know that you are never going to trust AI to fully make your admission decisions. But I do think the verify, right? The verify piece, that's what we're talking about. I mean,
Right.
there's more of that is coming where it's like, okay, all right, like I said, you summarize an essay, you summarize a rec letter, you pull out some things that have value. It doesn't mean you couldn't go read the whole thing if you wanted to. It just means it's going to spotlight or highlight some things or synthesize some things, and then you can take your time where it's helpful to go deeper. I mean, that's
You're right.
in general, I think what's so good about this whole topic.
Yeah, for sure. And as we've I think spoken about before, so much of the way that I think about it, again, coming back to my own fascination or obsession with efficiency, is it's not just saving time, and it's not saving time so I can go play whatever Candy Crush. It's how do I redirect that time? How do I repurpose
Yeah.
that time that I'm saving? If I'm
Yep.
going from 3 hours and writing a letter of recommendation, for example, down to whatever, 45 minutes to an hour, what am I doing with that recouped time?
Yeah.
That's the question. That's more of the ethical implication that I'm interested in than just saving time for the sake of saving time. So
Yeah, I mean, and you look at like data right now, I mean, most schools are having plummeting yield, you know, um, and if you can, and yet in some of those places, it's those schools too, sometimes that you get these emails back and it's like, I'm reading and I'll get back to you in like 3 months, or you can't get anybody to answer the phone or whatever. Like if we can there again, like just repurpose the time or raise the level of what people are doing, right? Like the whole like entering things, recalculating GPAs, like that needs to stop. We need to get, and I also, this is a whole different conversation, but that's also, I believe, part of our retention efforts too. If you can get people focused on higher level things, being more available to families, doing the stuff that really matters for making the class when it's all said and done, I have no problem with running AI to summarize, a rec letter.
now, just for point of clarification, understanding the background and experience of some of the people on this call, can you talk a little bit more about the concept of plummeting yield that you just made reference to, just to explain it a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the headlines often are about, certain schools getting tons more applications, right? So that's kind of what you read about. But I think, well, even with those places, even with those 50 to 75 schools that might be lumped into that group that have really accelerated application growth, they are when they make offers, let's say they make 100 offers, and 60 say yes. That's actually a very good return. That's a very high yield rate, right? The average yield rate now is in the 20s. around the country, and it's dropping. And that's really true across almost all of higher ed, is that there's a declining yield rate, even for the healthiest of schools, because more students are putting out more applications for all the reasons that you would imagine and know. And this is also like a vicious cycle, right? That continues to accelerate that. And so my point is that schools are very focused on converting students. Like the more they want more of the kids they say yes to say yes to them. And I guess my point is, if you can finish your review more quickly and get those admits on the street and then get working on converting them, you could rebound or mitigate some of the, issues that most schools have right now in their yield efforts.
No, thanks for explaining that. It's a complicated topic. In the course that I teach, we talk about the yield doom loop and the ways in which it's almost a self-perpetuating cycle with ultimately leading to greater confusion by students and greater number of applications submitted, different behaviors by universities in order to protect that, then therefore exacerbate the confusion by students, and it just keeps going around and around and around. This being my 23rd year, I've seen several revolutions of the yield doom loop. So, but so that said, in the chat as well, Brienne makes a comment about access. For those with disabilities and learning differences, there's folks who have better access with AI, and trying to police it makes it an ethical issue for those who need it. And so, one of my questions is this idea of equity, and what ways do you believe AI can either promote or hinder equity in college admissions?
Well, this is probably one of those things that I need to kind of keep examining. I would say initially, and largely my take on this is it is more democratization of assistance, because as we know in our country, and it's worse in some places than others, these counselor student ratios are extremely high, particularly in public schools. I think about where I live here in Georgia, and even in the county I live in, where seeing 400-to-1 ratios is not atypical at all, and certainly in some places higher than that. Oftentimes, in the same places where you have high student counselor ratios, you also have families that may not have as much of a background in higher education, or may not be as available to assist, even if they may be really helpful assistants. Whereas, all right, to your point about the kid like getting home from basketball practice and playing Candy Crush, because the way their circadian rhythms work, like they're best at midnight, most humans are asleep and not available. But AI it's 24/7. And so I think not only do we now have some assistance again around brainstorming, iterating, even the editing that some students may not have previously had, but it's also constantly available. And I think that to me is positive from an equity standpoint. I'm sure there's some angles to that I'm not considering, but largely that's the way I've seen it to this point. And I'd say in the majority of cases, it is some democratization of assistance.
Yeah, no, and the only, I mean, I'm not going to call it pushback, but the response that I have to that in regards to sort of conversations that I've been a part of is it presumes access to technology and computers, which not everyone has access to, and that's the sort of fundamental piece where so many students who are sort of from impoverished or underrepresented backgrounds have in many ways come from places where they didn't have technology. And now when there's a greater emphasis or greater advantage to be had, I guess that's the way I would put it, potential advantage. Some argue that it de-democratizes it. It further accentuates the advantages of those who already possess them.
Sure. And that's the kind of, angle, I guess, or point that I think is is probably valid, or at least worth really exploring and understanding more. Because, it's kind of like looking at cell phone availability, right? And it's surprising what you find when you dig into the data on that. I think what might be a layer to that, or another wrinkle to that, is even if they have it, do they know about it? Like, that's probably the one of the equity issues that we're talking about,
Are
right?
they
Like,
even aware? Yeah.
correct. Like, conversations like this, even stuff that, like I said, I mean, look, when I'm talking about how we talk about AI every day, well, I mean, you got to have the money to get there, and you got to, I mean, so like there's access issues there. We put stuff out online, but do some of these students know about some of the resources that are, available to them? And so, yes, I'm sure there are some pockets of exacerbation of inequity, but I also see some real glimmers of democratization in this as well.
Sure. And that's ultimately the way that I've always kind of framed it, is that idea that though there might be some folks who don't have access, those who do, among those who do, there's certainly a greater democratization of uh, all sorts of sort of attributes and positive gains.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're about 5 minutes left here, Rick, and I want to jump into the final sort of go here, which is specific to college counselors. And I'd love to sort of dive into this idea of, you made reference to it earlier in our conversation about counselors, say, for example, using artificial intelligence to help draft letters of recommendation. Where do you
Mhm.
come down? Where's Georgia Tech's policy come down? How do you make sense of that sort of dynamic?
Yeah. I mean, I'm all for it. Like, I guess what I would challenge, counselors to consider, and have really, over the course of the last, 6 to 8 months in particular, is like A/B test. Just do an A/B test. So, like, write a cold letter of rec for a student, in the way that you always have. However you've gathered information, however you've sort of gotten started, however you've ultimately formatted that, do it. Put the clock on and write it, and then use, the way that we've just been talking about students, like use ChatGPT or whatever it might be, you know, get a response back, put in some of your own, like touches and personalization. And then, like, don't just judge it for yourself. Actually hand it over to a colleague or someone else, right? And have them read it, because this is also kind of what we talk to students about. Like, we oftentimes will encourage a student to give their essay to, like, one of their parents' colleagues at work, an adult who doesn't know them and isn't biased necessarily towards them. And, like, what do they get out of the essay? Like, that's a pretty good simulation of what it might be like when it's read by an adult in a college admission office. Similarly here, like, don't give it to one of your colleagues who just knows exactly how you always write, and is whatever. But, like, somebody in the school building who maybe hasn't really read a lot of your stuff in the past, and let them read both and give you some feedback on that, and start the clock both times. Because I think what you'll find is that you can arrive at the same place of doing a solid job of articulating the students' assets and what they can contribute, and doing it in a much reduced amount of time. Like, job done, and check, moving on from that, because we're not grading your rec letters. And yeah, I mean, I think there's some people who are pretty tied to the convention of it. But if they really sit and stop to think, like, what is truly the best use of my time in serving my school community and advocating for my kids, I think it's being more available, and making sure the rec letters um, are communicating that. And I really do think you can do that through these models.
Such an interesting point, in particular, because recently I was having a conversation with I would say of a with a counselor of a older generation, and there are certain stereotypes that accompany folks like this. And he really pointed out that it took him a long time to come around on the concept of a bulleted letter of recommendation from a counselor,
Mm, yeah,
because he had been so fixated for so much of his career on the craft of writing the, 2-page blocks of text,
yeah.
letters of recommendation. And then when he started to hear the feedback, he started to hear the
Mm,
feedback and the ways in which the changes to these bulleted letters impact things. He started to turn the corner, and he was commenting after having heard me talk a little bit about the ways in which you might use ChatGPT to sort of
mhm.
accelerate your process in drafting. He was not on board. I want to be clear. He was not on board, but he was saying he can see how he might get there in the
Yeah.
same way that he got to the bulleted letter. But that said, here with our last minute, Rick, how do you see AI evolving in college admissions moving forward over the next decade, 5 years, 1 year, whatever time frame you think is
Yeah.
appropriate?
Well, on the high school side and the applicant side, I really do I do believe that we are going to get to this proliferation. I think that AI is going to challenge schools to want other mediums, and so I think that students are going to have the opportunity sooner than later to consider, is writing the way, and is this really the way that I want to communicate my voice and help people to better understand me beyond the other stuff they're getting on my application. Um, and so I think in that regard, from the applicant side, I think more choice is coming, and I think that's positive. On the college side, again, sort of, I guess to reiterate something I said before, the integration of machine learning, across the board, whether it be, as I said, it's kind of scraping for data. The other thing we're already doing, and it's easier than ever before, is you can take a high school data, from the past, and a student or sort of profile of a student from that school who's now on your campus, and see how they're performing. And this sort of machine learning concept of, okay, I'm reading this applicant right now. They came from the same school. They have a profile that looks like this aggregation, perhaps, of kids from that school who are now at Georgia Tech. And it's
Right.
it's just another way to sort of predict or get context around how they may do on your campus, which at the end of the day is our job. And so I
Right.
think that's also positive. And of course, in places you don't have applicants previously, then you wouldn't be able to use that. Uh, but it would be significantly helpful in many, many cases, and again, reduce time.
Well, I appreciate that response, and I'll just sort of piggyback. Maybe this will come as a shock or surprise to you, but I had a conversation recently with offline, a representative from a liberal arts college that shall not be named. And they said, and I was asking about whether artificial intelligence was finding its way into their process in any way, shape, or form. And they said, yeah, it's amazing. It's allowing us finally to track the success rate of students from specific high schools now that
Yeah.
they're at our school.
Yep.
And it was really, to me, just a shock that they hadn't already been doing that in some way, shape, or form.
It's been a systems issue. I mean, like we had, just disparate systems, and it was like duct taping things together to try to get at that. We've tried it for years, but it's like just so much
Simpler.
easier. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. We're at time here, and I really appreciate your time. Your thoughts have been really valuable, and thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hope you have a good rest of your evening. I know you've got some travel coming up, and but that said, thank you for all of the people who logged in, and please be in touch if you have any particular questions. Again, thanks a lot, Rick.
Yeah. Thank you. Good to see everybody tonight. Take care.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.